So now what I'm doing is I'm laying up the clay. I'm getting ready to lay up the clay wall, and I'm using a brand new bag of the water-based clay. At this consistency right out of the bag, this clay is perfect for making the walls. What I do is I just cut off the top, maybe a quarter of an inch maybe. Thickness is good. It's got to hold up under its own weight, for one thing. And I just cut across the top. And then when I lay it down, I cut them in half. Or you can just run your cutter, which could be whatever, a wire. They actually have clay cutters there that you can buy for $1.50. It's just two handles and a piece of wire. I use the music wire that I've got laying around for different things. I use it, I cut it. It cuts very easy, it cuts like butter. And I go down the middle, and then I go across. And so I've got slabs of clay that are it's like 5 or 6 inches long by 2 inches or so high. And the height will dictate about how thick this mold's going to be. I want it to be 1.5 inches or 2 inches thick. To hold shape, keep from warping or whatever, making it really tough, because you spend all this time sculpting. You want to keep the image in that mold as long as possible. So we're laying them out, we're looking at them, everything's cool. We got some scrap clay here we can use to help reinforce the clay wall. So we start putting on the wall just by, sometimes I will cut the very inside piece of the clay wall and get it perfectly flat if it's not, and then lay it up against the sculpture. But you see me here, that's what I'm laying this wall up. And I'm getting that clay wall 90 degrees from the sculpture. It's important this be 90 degrees from the sculpture, because if it's less, if it's tilting in, say we're tilting in toward that ear, when the two halves come apart, you'll look at a cross section of that back half. Instead of being a 90 degree, it'll be very steep. It's more likely that will chip off. For this, it really doesn't make any difference, and I'll keep reiterating this because most of this is going to be covered with hair. But it's good to keep it in practice. If you do something that's like all reptilian or something, you want front and back perfectly shaped, you're going to have to really work that clay wall, and it's got to be 90 degrees to your sculpture. We make it as flat as possible. Since we have this plastic barrier on here, we can spray it and spray the clay wall and make it sort of melted into our surface and keep it flat using our tools. Boom, 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 raking, keeping it flat all the way across. And we do this all the way around. If we have some areas where the two clay walls don't meet because of an angle, like we're moving it across the top of a rounded area, you have some of these scrap clay laying there, and you cut out a wedge, you cut out a dart shape, and you stick it in there and you clean off that surface. What's going on here with this clay wall is, if you can't figure it out, is that this clay wall we're making is keeping the front half from being touched by all the plaster that we're going to slather on and then later lay on with fiber and all this other kind of stuff. We're going to build up the back half first. Once it's hard, we will take this clay wall off, and what we'll have is the back half encased, the front half free, and then a wall there dividing the two, the front and the back. While we're talking about halves and laying up clay walls and so forth, look at where your halfway point is on your life cast. This is real important. There is a horrible little gnome called the undercut, which will drive you insane sometimes. When you're pouring a liquid that will become a solid onto a solid, sometimes it will wrap around. I guess I can give you a visual aid here. If you're making a mold of something that's perfectly round, you got to go the halfway point to make the back half and the front half. You cannot go to the 60-40 route. You got to go 50-50, or you will not pull it off, because undercuts, those little goobers that wrap all the way around and it gets locked in there, that's the worst thing in the world to feel. Now some people, we'll reinforce this, so if we crack this thing, we can crack it do whatever you need to do and glue it back together again and whatever. But it's best to not go through all that trouble. Undercuts. Imagine, and this is very difficult to do sometimes, imagine when you're pouring on the plaster that once it's hard. You have to look for undercuts that will grab and hold on to whatever's rigid, plaster, whatever. Clay, no big deal. It's going to tear that clay all to pieces. That's why it's good to use a lot of clay. You just tear it all up. Watch for these things. So we've filled every nook and cranny with our clay wall. Sometimes for certain designs, when the front and the back of the mask is exposed, again, something that doesn't have hair on it, you have to go in every little nook and cranny. If there's folds, if there's scales, you have to be in there and make that clay wall 90 degrees from your sculpture at the halfway mark. It's got to cut it pretty much in half. You can cheat, but be careful cheating. It all depends on what you're working off of. Got our clay wall going on there. We're backing it with pieces of scrap clay, holding those walls up. Another little secret. As you go, this clay that you're using, the moisture will evaporate out of it, especially if it's a warm summer evening like what I was working on. This clay will firm up even more, and it gets firmer in that position, and it really is a good wall. It'll hold up. Once you get it all flattened and even in 45-degree angles, we'll start making what I call the keys, registration keys, whatever. Some people take ping pong balls, there's 6 for $1.50, cut them down the middle, press them into the clay wall carefully. Boom, that's all you need. It's actually a very good key because it's round. There's nothing to catch anywhere. There's no hard edges to catch on the front and the back. I like to make mine out of clay. I don't know why. I've stopped that recently because I've bought a set that are made of silicone that I can stick real quickly. It saves time. The ping pong ball is good. Some people just run a sculpting tool all the way around and cut out a little groove in there. The reason for keys, the reason for having the square ones, the round ones, the grooves, the silicone ones, the hex, whatever shape you want to use, meaning whatever shape you want to use, not having it an undercut. It should taper toward you. If you can't see the entire surface of your key at one glance, it's the wrong angle. It'll catch on the front. Make them like here, this little weird square shaped thing. Make them taper down like a pyramid. The reason for these things is to register the front and the back simply. It's like when you take the front of the head of Dracula model and you want to register it to the back of the head of Dracula's model. They have these little pins and holes that register, and they're together. It's the same thing, except we're putting a negative together, and inside we'll make the positive. These keys are 4, and I usually put 3 or 4. It all depends on how big it is. You can make them really shallow if you're afraid of getting them caught up on something. Make them shallow. You don't have to make them very deep. The ping pong ball idea is a really good idea, actually. And once we have our clay wall, separating wall up, we got our keys. We give that a coat or two of the clear plastic spray to separate that from the plaster. Remember how our chemistry works. Water-based materials will stick to water-based materials. Sometimes people will use, for a separator between two halves, front and the back, they'll use slip, which is this clay watered down, as a separator, but I don't like that. You can tell where the line of separation is because it's a different color, but I don't like to do that. So I got this thing about water-based material, touching water-based material, touching more water-based material. I like putting something in between there. What we're going to do now is I'm going to mix up some plaster, and the plaster I'm using is Hydrocal. It's a porous plaster. It's technically considered a stone, which makes it hard. Now this stuff is fast, like plaster of Paris sets up. So you got to work pretty quick. Use the coolest amount of water you can. The cooler the water, the better. If it's a warm day, really try to get that water cool. Even if you take your amount of water that you're using and put it in a refrigerator or whatever. But you'll use a lot of water to do the front and the back half of this mold. I'm mixing, I'm eyeballing, I'm guessing about how much by eyeballing how much water I'm going to need. And I'm mixing the plaster into the water. They say never do the other, but it's not because it's going to do anything to it. It's just easier to figure out. You're going to use 1 part water, 2 parts plaster almost all the time. So you might as well mix it up, plaster to water, because you'll have more than you need, maybe, but it's nice to have it if you need it. So I'm mixing my plaster and my water. I like to use gloves so I can feel it. And the consistency we're going after before we start brushing it on here is the consistency of melted ice cream. You don't want it real watery. It'll take longer to set up. You'll have more working time, but it won't cling to your life cast. It won't cling to your sculpture. You have to understand that we're trying to brush on this material onto a plastic coating, a material, and it's gonna beat up like it is here, and it's just gonna run off. But there's a trick. If you brush it on a microscopic level, very, very small level, you are coarsening that surface, and the plaster is grabbing on. So you brush it on once or twice, it beads up, fine. Do it some more, and I guarantee you, with that consistency, it will layer up, and you will get a nice, what they call a splash coat all over. I'm going into the area where the clay wall is touching the sculpture. I'm getting the details where the keys are at. I'm going into the ear, every wrinkle. This is what the splash coat is for, brushing it on, getting every single detail. It runs off, dip your brush in, get more. I use a little cheap brush. They call them chip brushes, hardware brushes, because the plaster will set up in this brush if you don't wash it out real well. Even if you wash it out, it still kind of gradually builds up in it. I can get 2 or 3 uses out of these, and I chunk them. So we're building up the first splash coat, getting it all in there, working it. And we're getting ready for our next layer. Now, you'll notice the plaster will get, hydrocal will get denser, thicker as we go. Just keep splashing it on there. Do this quickly, move pretty quickly. A trick I like to use, and I use not on the gorilla, but on masks I've done since then. I use canned air, compressed air, and I blast that surface after I've brushed on a few layers. If there's any bubbles, they're gone. I layer on some more, brush on some more, boom, 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 blast it again, getting in all these little details. I try to get rid of these bubbles. Then I keep going and ladling on more. It'll get thicker and thicker, and we keep on adding our splash coat thicker and thicker. And eventually, our splash coat will not be a splash coat anymore. It'll be thick.